Okay. All right, the cosmological argument. This is the second of the five. Again, treat this with a grain of salt in a sense because there is overlap. Um, some arguments borrow from others, and I, for one, am absolutely okay with that. Some people are not. I think it's a strike against one of these arguments. But the cosmological argument, the way we're going to break this down, first of all, is in what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Let me write that on the board because that's very different kind of. In fact, let me do it like this. Well, let's do Roman numerals so that that's not a premise to our argument. That's our outline. That's just a word that talks about the Muslim school of theology in the Middle Ages, the Kalam, their theology. So that's why it's called that, because it's borrowed from them. But then there's also, what should we call this? The Aristotelian, let's just say Aristotle Thomas. Did I spell it right? Yeah. Thomas Aquinas. So the Thomistic Aristotelian version, but they're both the same thing in the sense of but they use different reasoning. They mean different things, and a lot of people don't know that. One apologist, Norman Geisler, who's not necessarily being represented in either of these, but he talks about this breakdown. He calls these the horizontal and the vertical. The horizontal and the vertical kind of cosmological reasoning. Here's what he means. The former, the horizontal being the Kalam school, the latter, like the ways of Thomas Aquinas, that they had their roots in Aristotle. Here's what he means. The vertical, I'm switching now. The vertical shows how the universe continues to be because of a need of some first cause or prime mover. The horizontal shows how it came to be. Now, in a sense, this does too. What's going to happen is that this reasoning doesn't depend on this. So you're going to see a difference, and that's actually going to be kind of important. Let's look at the Kalam cosmological argument first. That, I think, how should I? In broader evangelical circles, if you're into apologetics, this is the version you've heard, even though you've heard of Thomas Aquinas. And I think one of the things that happens, though, is you think that this is the same as that. And the Kalam cosmological argument, so named after the medieval school of philosophy and theology, was first articulated by Al-Ghazali in the Middle Ages. You don't have to know that, but he was working this out at the same time that Anselm was working out the logic of the ontological argument. And it's been refined in our own day by William Lane Craig of Biola University, and really one of the foremost debaters and Christian apologists of our time. One advantage to the Kalam cosmological argument is that it's really the simplest to state. People like this when it's 1, 2, 3, the way I wrote the ontology. But this is easier to see at first glance. Then it gets complex, defending it. But here's how it goes. 2 premises and a conclusion. Let's remember to do this nice and big for the viewing audience. Premise 1, everything, and I'll have to erase it when I get over there, but at least you'll get the idea. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. I had no idea that would take up that much room, but it did. Let's bring in the first objection to the cosmological argument right now, because I don't think I have it in my later section. Wait a minute. If everything has a cause, don't look at that for a second because you'll be cheating. If everything has a cause and God is a thing, then God has a cause. What caused God? Basic 5-year-old thought, natural thought. But it also tripped up famous philosophers like John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell. Oh yeah, I was a Christian back in the day, but then I had this epiphany. What caused God? That's your epiphany? Man. First of all, it's not the law of cause and effect. The law of cause and effect is not that everything has a cause. It's that every effect has a cause. Here we go again. You're just defining that way up front now. But you're going to see that the naturalist, the materialist, the atheist, if he's going to anchor his boat in modern science as he thinks he can, he has to believe in the law of cause and effect. So don't be too quick to throw that away if you're a skeptic. So that's our first premise. Pretty uncontroversial, you would think. Premise 2. Here's the controversial one that has all sorts of hidden premises and has to be defended the most. The universe began to exist. The universe began to exist. Really? How'd you get that? So we'll have to defend that. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, obviously, as a matter of formal logic, if you grant the premises, it's valid. Nobody will doubt that this is a valid syllogism. They're just going to attack the second premise, right? Some people who are postmodernists will even attack this, or even people who misappropriate quantum physics will sometimes doubt this too, but they're making a mistake. They're misapplying something. Having said that, this is going to be the main thing that we have to defend. But there is another problem. Before we go on, there is another problem with this problem. Christians will even bring up this objection, and that is the fact that if the universe requires a cause, it does not seem to directly demonstrate that the Christian idea of God must be that cause, right? So if the universe has to have a cause, what have you told me in here, at least, that shows me that that has to be the God of Scripture? Okay? Man, I hope I don't forget, but if I do forget, remind me. After we're done with all the proofs, that second session in 2 weeks, when I do a wrap-up of natural theology, I want to answer that, because that is one of the most frustrating things that causes people to neglect natural theology. This leaves us light years away from the God of Scripture. Wait a minute. I see what's happening here. Because this doesn't say more than that God is the first cause. Somebody could say, but God is so much more than the first cause. True. But you can level that criticism against every statement in Scripture about God. Every statement in Scripture about God only tells you one or two or a couple of things at a time, and not everything at a time. So that is really special pleading, that objection against natural theology. Oh, God is the first, he's the prime mover? Aristotle could have agreed with that. Oh, he's the moral lawgiver? Cicero could have agreed with that. What's your point? The Bible ascribes all sorts of things to God that a pagan could agree with. So that is special pleading. That is nonsense. But you hear that from all different kinds of fideistic schools, and I won't pick on them right now. I'll just try to remember that when we come up to it. Anyway, for now, we want to move on to the central idea behind this version of the cosmological form, and that will start to explain why it must be the case that the universe began to exist. So, let's, I can't do a cross-section of it, it's over there, but let's, like a foundation to a house. So forget that this is a syllogism going this way, pretend it's a house now, but it's a foundation under the second premise. So we're really just dealing with this, put a red square around it just so you remember that. We're really just defending this because that's where all the controversy is. You don't need to defend this and this. So I'm going to put a foundation under this, and we're going to ask about this central idea. Why must it be? And the central idea, and I've never thought to draw this as a foundation to a house, so I hope this picture, it works. Here's the idea. The impossibility of infinite regress. Now, that's surfacey compared to where we're going. I might have to put foundations under that or give you a cross-section of what's meant by that, but that's really the foundation of this. There are two basic reasons that an infinite regress in effects or events or sequences is impossible. By the way, caveat, this does not mean, don't make this objection, this does not mean the impossibility of an infinite being or the impossibility of infinity. An infinite regress, again, is ... that way or that way of actual things in a sequence of cause and effect and so forth. So right away, it doesn't apply to God, as we're going to see about the simplicity of God, because God's not made of parts. He is not in sequence, and so forth. But, I just want to throw that in there. Two reasons why this is impossible. The first one is philosophical. The second one is scientific. I don't know the most picturesque way to do this, so let's not think too hard. Let's just put 1, 2. Two reasons why this is impossible. The first one is philosophical, and so its impossibility is going to be a necessary impossibility. It is if it makes good on its claim, it's going to be saying that it is necessarily impossible for there to be an infinite regress. We'll come to that. The second reason is scientific, and therefore, this is a... Let's put contingent. I'm fine with that. I was going to say it's necessarily impossible, assuming the current model of scientific whatever. Okay, so this argument's actually not going to be as strong as this argument. Now today, so then why even go into it? Because, well, one reason, because people have this high esteem for science, and frankly, modern people confuse scientific evidence and scientific laws and results and consensus with proof. That shows backward thinking, but at any rate, there's a value in it, even if you have to change when scientific models change. So I'll bring it up. It's worth getting into. Okay, let's look at these two lines of reasoning. The first reasoning is philosophical, and that means that this impossibility is going to be an absolute impossibility. In no possible world can you have an infinite regress of sequential effects, events, things like that. Okay? Why is that? And another way that Craig says it, William Lane Craig uses this language all the time, the principle that the infinite cannot be traversed. And I like doing this with my finger. You teach kids for a while, you do hand signals and stuff. And I think it makes it easier even as you're teaching it. It reminds you. So the infinite cannot be traversed. You can see why. When are you going to stop that, Matt? Well, I'm going to infinity. So you see why. The infinite cannot be traversed. Why? Let's go one step down further. Because, first of all, an actual infinite number of things cannot exist. Wait a minute. Yes, it can on the number line. That's going to be one of the objections. But an actual infinite number of things in a sequence cannot exist. Now, this can be fairly complex, so we're just going to look at a summary. The term actual infinite is actually a technical term in set theory in mathematics. When you or I conjure up the idea of an infinite number of things, what we really have in view is more correctly called a potential infinite. In other words, a set that is able to increase the number of its members, or an extension of a line in geometry, which theoretically can keep going. And the potential is theoretically indefinite when we apply it to actual entities. The idea is that I don't see the whole. I can't call this a set and cap it. The whole idea is that I can always add another one. Just like we were looking at with the pineapples and the pepperonis on the pizza, I can always come up with a greater idea and so forth. That, by definition, is a potential infinite in terms of our perspective and how we number it and so forth. Aristotle talked about this because he was debating against, you brought up Zeno's paradox, and one of the things he was trying to disprove is this idea that change was an illusion. Zeno's paradoxes, if you're familiar with them, or ways, I don't think he actually believed that a person couldn't move because he had to traverse an infinite amount of points in between the points. That was the idea. He was just trying to demonstrate, or he was trying to confound people who believed who think you can get around that very easily. Aristotle, anyway, long story short, I don't want to give you any boring Greek philosophical history. Aristotle argued that an actual infinite is paradoxical. But an actual infinite set would be a set which is complete. Now think about that for a second. To which not one more member could be added. Okay. Now, the German mathematician David Hilbert came up with a few illustrations to show why this concept is absurd. For our entertainment, beyond anything theoretical, of actual sequences of things. For our entertainment value, he called this Hilbert's Hotel. There may be other examples or metaphors or whatever that he used, but this is the one that William Lane Craig refers to, so it's the one that I know about, Hilbert's Hotel. Let Craig tell the story. Try to picture this as best as you can. If I tried to draw it, we'd take all night, and it would make a big mess of the board. Imagine a hotel. Try to picture it on the board. You get the idea. If you're looking at it like this, take the wall off, and you're just picturing the rooms like squares. Okay, so picture a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, okay? And suppose once more that all the rooms are full. There is not a single vacant room throughout the entire infinite hotel. It's an actual infinite. Now suppose a new guest shows up, asking for a room. But of course, says the proprietor, and he immediately shifts the person in room 1 into room 2. And the person in room 2 into room 3. The person in room 3 into room 4, and so on and so on and so on to infinity. Now, as a result of these room changes, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest gratefully checks in. But remember, before he arrived, all the rooms were full. Equally curious, according to the mathematicians, there are now no more persons in the hotel than there were before, because the number is just infinite. Now the rabbit hole into Wonderland gets deeper and deeper, because if an infinity of new scenario, an infinity of new customers shows up, the proprietor does it again. Pretend he has time to do this. Shifting the guy from room 2 into room 4, room 3 into room 6, 4 into 8, you see that times 2, making all the prior guests residing in even number rooms. Guess how greatly the number of paying customers increased? None at all. The process could be repeated an infinity of times. The result would never change. And the absurdities run the other way too. Now let's pretend people check out. The number has not decreased. Now, what's the takeaway from all this? And Craig goes into this in great detail, but I think it's enough to make the point. It can be perceived in this simple question: can such a hotel exist in reality? You see, theoretically, you look at number lines, if you've ever seen this in a math textbook, these number lines next to each other, real numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 4, 6, whatever, which has more? Neither. They're both, so you see that theoretically, and one of the objections against, you'll hear it from Bertrand Russell, we'll wait to get to it, but the reason it can't work is because when you're applying it to actual things in a sequence, it leads to all these kinds of absurdities. So if it can't exist in reality, you have to ask, why not? In the real world, Craig says, you cannot form an actually infinite collection of things by adding one member after another, because it would be impossible to get to infinity. Now, if that's true this way, it'll also be true this way. In fact, one of the crudest ways that I have explained this, usually to the kids, this illustration, I don't have any room on the board. The incline, I want to roll the ball on the incline. I don't know where I got this idea. I don't even know if I came up with it. Okay, so I want to roll the ball down incline. Each rotation of the ball is obviously going to represent a unit of some kind, and I want to get it to the bottom. That's the whole point, because it's an incline. For fun or something. I don't know. But let's suppose that this is an infinite incline. And to make this work, let's suppose again that I have Go-Go Gadget arm, and my arm is an infinite arm, and I extend back all the way back and back and back. Question number 1, when do I release the ball? I don't. Because I never get to the end, because the incline and my arm go on to infinity. But if I never release the ball, when does rotation of the ball number 1 happen? It doesn't. But if rotation of the ball number 1 doesn't happen, when does rotation number 2 happen? It doesn't. And then when does rotation number 3 happen? And you get the idea into each intermediate step to the present rotation of the ball. So if you had an infinite series of moments before the present moment, then the present moment would have never arrived. Because the first moment is a misnomer. There would have been no first moment. But if no first moment, there would have been no second moment, and then no third. Neither would there be any intermediate moment, and the present moment would have never arrived. But here we are. I said that to a math teacher one time at BSU. They said, "Oh, you're just thinking linearly." And I said, "Nope, wait for it." And I got to this argument right here. But leave that aside. This is the simplest way to explain it. And I grant that. There are but what if the universe is, and all these different things, infinite? And when we get to the scientific one, you'll see other models and ways you can try to get around that. But that's sort of an introductory way to look at it. There's also, I said that philosophically, he's saying, philosophically, you can't have a set of, in this case, moments, or let's use the word E for effects or events. I like that better because people, time is relative. Okay, you're missing the point. You can't have an infinite set of sequential real things, real entities happen for that reason. It is philosophically incoherent. That's the argument here. Come back to that. There's also a scientific reason. I won't spend as much time on this because I think it's a weaker argument. I think Craig would agree with that. But it's still strong existentially because people have this esteem for science and they don't even know what they're talking about. But a sufficient reason from science, from two developments in the past century and a half of cosmology and the laws of conservation of energy and things like that, that have made a finite beginning to time and space an inevitable conclusion, if you accept these scientific models, if you apply them consistently. And I'm speaking about the Big Bang model of cosmology and the laws of conservation of energy, particularly the second law of thermodynamics. People misunderstand this too. The first law says matter of energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's constant in the universe. And this, okay, you're equivocating there, number one. But we're talking about in a closed system. I'm imagining objections. They're going to object to that. But maybe it's not a closed system. Parallel universe, multiverse, oscillating model of the universe, collapsing in and out on itself and so forth. I'm going to answer that in a little bit. But if you accept, now let's take the other side. Let's say you don't want to accept, for example, the Big Bang model. I have a book, a guy named Eric Lerner, I think, not a Christian, secularist, unbeliever. It's called The Big Bang Never Happened. There are Christians and because they're horrified by it. Einstein and Eddington at the beginning of the 20th century, they looked at the evidence for the Big Bang and they were horrified because it implied God. Now you may have other reasons to reject the Big Bang. My point at the moment is twofold. Christians and atheists accept and reject the Big Bang. There's people on all sides of that. If you're inclined to reject the Big Bang, fine. But for anyone who accepts it, it will come at a cost to your skepticism. I'm not going to labor the point here too much since we're not studying scientific apologetics, but I will mention one thing, that the empirical data that was so suggestive of this model in the 1920s was this outward expansion of the universe in all directions. And the second law of thermodynamics, and again, crude model, picture a balloon going out, or I don't know what, just something going outward, right? But that involves energy and the use of energy and so forth. And you have this other finding, this other pretty accepted law of modern science, the second law of thermodynamics, operating universally in the universe. I said that to a biology professor one time at BSU. I will not mention his name. But he said, our solar system, he called it a pocket of resistance. Because you can see how the second law of thermodynamics would challenge various aspects of evolutionary theory. But of course, the heat of the sun and so forth. We have this moment where we're doing uphill for the moment. Okay, I could do that with my energy drinks. But you could also die from that pretty quickly. Anyway, it just, you can go all these different rabbit trails with this. Here's the point. The principle of entropy, namely that all energy in a closed system passes in one direction, from heat to cold, order to disorder, integration to disintegration. The upshot of this principle, the takeaway, can be summarized by something C.S. Lewis once said, very simply, that if all the energy in the universe is winding down, it would have had to, at some point, been wound up. Oh, that's clever and poetic, but nah. No, it's for this reason. It's for that infinite regress reason. In other words, if the maximal state of order existed in an infinite past, Well, then in a closed system, the maximal state of disorder would have likewise occurred in the infinite past, right? There's no starting point to it. I mean, you're really going back there, like forever. But the universe is not currently in a maximum state of disorder, which means that it is not eternal, but had a beginning in the finite past. Now, only some sufficient cause outside of the system, and this is where their objections are going to come in, could be the source of its energy. So, your hot cocoa gets cold, simple solution, microwave. Okay, right? You pump new energy into the closed system, which is the cup. Open the cup, microwave, boom. Problem solved. And so, parallel universe, multiverses. The oscillating model, even Stephen Hawking suggested this because he understood, it's sort of an accordion. That the universe collapses in on itself and, and so forth. It gets going again, and then the process happens again. So that can happen infinitely. That's great, theoretically. The problem is, just one problem with that, is that it's a little bit less like science. See, science works by what you do observe, not by what you would like to observe. And so you have to, yes, there's a theoretical dimension to science, but you have to be very careful calling something science which solves the problem, but which is not actually observed in the fundamental constant laws that you see everywhere in the universe. Okay, done with that. The Aristotelian argument. I may go long. It's for a good cause, because this is really a stronger argument. And Ed Fazer especially is really good on this. Let's get rid of all this. And this is good stuff. What Craig does there is good, and I know the objections against it. I think I've kind of suggested, we'll bring up some other ones, why some of them won't work. Let's hurry up. Okay, because we're going to have to do some Aristotle 101 in order to get this. I don't want to do a part 1 and 2 in this. I want to keep schedule. Let's go right to the first two of Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways to show God's existence at the beginning of his Summa Theologica. And we can summarize the first way in just a second, but let me read his version first. Sorry, I got to draw a picture. Oh boy, when's the last time I've done this? I don't know. Acorn, tree. This way, 1, 2. I'll leave it at that. And I'm going to use 2 words at first. Potential, or you could write, if you want, noun form, potency, and act. And so let's call this actual. Yes. Start with that. He uses language that you might think is archaic, and in one sense it is, but as Fazer points out, none of this depends on certain scientific ideas that Thomas inherited from Aristotle that are passé. These are metaphysical concepts that in no way are challenged by those very misconceptions abound. I'll come back to that. Here's the first way. This is Aquinas' first way to show God's existence. Just so you know, remember the a posteriori from that first session? He's looking at things in the world. That's how he starts. Hey, look at these things in the world. Now, what do you need to explain those things in the world? And you arrive at something more general. That's the direction. It's called a posteriori, from experience. And here's the thing in the world that he's looking at. So those are just some clues, some pictures. Let's read it. Aquinas says this: the first and more manifest way to show God's existence is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Understatement. All things are in motion, but you get the idea. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be put in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion. It's becoming that. You can use the word change for motion. It'll cash out the same way. Whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion, or change, is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But, next step, but nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. There has to be really some third thing that becomes the new number 1. 3. Something already in act and I know this is archaic language, reduces from potency to act, affects the change, the nature of that acorn, which is to become the tree, can only be moved in that direction by something outside of itself. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible, here's this motion, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in a different respect. For what is actually, he's using a different example, sorry about that, what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect, in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then, okay, back up a step. If that by which it is put in motion be, don't lose it, be itself be put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, right? And that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover. As the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. That example is crucial, the staff and the hand, because they seem to be moving at the same time, because they are. But are you confused that maybe the staff's moving the hand? Of course not. You know that the hand is moving the staff. That's an important difference between this kind of argument and the one I just made that Craig does from the beginning, an ordered series that's temporal. This is saying a bit more, okay? Therefore, he says, it is necessary to arrive at the first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Okay, so let me summarize that. I said to myself, I was talking to myself earlier, that I would put these on the board. We won't survive if I try to put these on the board, these 8 points. And the picture's so beautiful. I don't know if I think I need that later. So I'm going to summarize what I put here. I'm going to summarize what you just heard in easier language. Okay? 8 steps, I think. Yes, 8 steps. 1, our senses show us that things are in motion. 2, things move when potential motion becomes actual motion. That's all that means by in act, the perfection of motion. Only an actual motion, this first thing, can convert a potential motion into an actual motion. 4, nothing can be at once both actuality and potentiality in the same respect. 5, therefore nothing can move itself. 6, therefore each thing in motion is moved by something else. 7, the sequence of motion cannot extend. Now I'm not going to go this way. Watch my finger. Cannot extend ad infinitum. Go up, go down. Doesn't matter. Subatomic or just the staff in the hand or the pool cue in the, anyway. The sequence of motion cannot extend ad infinitum. Finally, number 8, therefore it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Now, this part of it is identical to Craig's reasoning. You can't have an infinite be traversed, to use Craig's language. There has to be a first motion, otherwise there would be no motion in the universe. Here's Thomas's second way. I'll just give you the summarization version. I won't read. But and it looks at first, a lot of people think, oh, the second's just the same as the first, except instead of using the word motion and change, he uses the word cause. No. We're not going to do that. Because, and I'm going to try to make this all one picture. A little bit more Aristotle 101. And people that have been around me for a while certainly know this, but the 5 kinds of causes. Above this line, we'll talk about the 2 main causes, number 1 and number 5. And by the way, I know Aristotle only talked about 4, but instrumental causes are important in this sense, and that was later developed. But you have a first and a final cause, or in other words, the other words he used for these are efficient and end cause. And this is the actor himself. And why is this one up here? Because the actor, this is his reason for acting. As we'll see in Aquinas' fifth argument, this is in a sense the cause of causes. Why did this thing happen? Well, there's a secondary level made up of three causes. One is what's called the material cause. Look at this, the material. I just make that by red, but the tree, the chemical composition, that's what we call the material cause, but it doesn't have to be chemical. It's just the nature of the physical stuff here, however you break that down. But then there's the actual thing itself, and it could be the action or it could be the form of a table. It could be the form of a law, but let's not get too heady, the form of a tree. And so let's put a dotted line around it to signify the nature of the thing, which is wrapped up in here already genetically, by the way. That's why this is potentially this. And so that's the formal cause. But you need another, because he just said, now let's say that this picture, I did this before, was lumber and a table, right? Scraps of lumber made into a table. Then you could see it clearer because you have an intelligent actor. You have a saw. Oh, I'll butcher this. Teeth, you get the idea. That's a saw, trust me. That's an instrumental cause. What am I doing? I still have the acorn in the tree up there. You get the idea. Follow along. This is a scrap of lumber and a table, okay? You need what Aristotle and Aquinas call a substance in act to actualize the potential, the nature that's locked up in this to become this. This form. We're not going to get too deeply into this, because this gets into the teleological argument, but we just needed a little bit of Aristotle 101, because this second way is really saying, it's saying more. We see in the world efficient causes. Scientists have to believe in efficient causes. After the 15th, 16th century, they sure didn't believe in this anymore, and they had their reasons, and they totally messed up the world with that. But anyway, read Ed Fazer's books on that. But at any rate, they still believed in a material cause, instrumental causes-ish, but especially this, because all this really means is the thing that caused it. And that could be a single action, or it could be a matrix of activities. Some people object to these arguments on the ground that that's so simplistic. Ha, ha, ha. The cause of the tree is the acorn by itself. What about the squirrel? What about the wind? What about the water? What about the city planner who planted the tree? And all these different things. And it's like, okay, you're imposing your simplicity and your straw man on what Aristotle was thinking. No, the efficient cause just is the sum total of the whole matrix of all that precedes the act. Okay? And so, with that in mind, we see in the world, let me summarize now, we perceive, number one, a series of efficient causes of things in the world. What we normally mean by the word cause. The thing that caused the thing after it. Two, nothing exists prior to itself, right? Nothing can cause itself, okay? A thing comes into existence if it's a caused thing. Remember, if you're an atheist, you don't want to believe in a thing that's uncaused and it's just eternally and immutably there. Okay, number three, therefore nothing in the world is the efficient cause of itself. Four, if a previous efficient cause does not exist, neither does the effect. Now, assuming that it's its effect, there's going to be a challenge from quantum physics. And again, remember I said it's a misapplication of it. 5, therefore, if the first thing in a series does not exist, nothing in the series exists. And so you get this is the same form as the other arguments at this point. If the first, but here's one difference, because what Craig was saying, something more like this, some people think that all this is saying is that you need a first one of these triangles to get these ones going. That would create problems, actually. This is saying more than that. You actually need something of a different order then this ordered series altogether. These, in fact, are all instrumental causes. They are all substances in act which themselves are put in motion. You need something that explains the instrumentality to begin with, an actual efficient cause, which is sufficient to, that doesn't have these aspects, that doesn't exhibit the need to be actualized. I did skip ahead, sorry about that, but I'm trying to show you that there's a big difference. This one's really saying, this is B. This set is the different kind of things. You need something, a totally different order of being to explain the actualization of any of these things. And Phaser, in fact, uses this phrase parenthetically throughout his writings. He keeps saying it like a broken record, so you get the idea. He keeps saying the phrase here and now. You need some act to actualize things, not just at the beginning of a series, like it's that infinite incline. You need something to explain the actualization of potentiality here and now, and so forth. Okay? So let me go on there. Therefore, if the first thing in a series does not exist, nothing in the series exists. 6, if the series of efficient causes extends ad infinitum into the past or into the subatomic level, into the, it covers everything, then nothing would now exist. But that is plainly false because all things do exist. That's step number 7. Number 8, therefore efficient causes do not extend ad infinitum. 9, this is the last one. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause to which everyone gives the name of God. That's what Aquinas is saying. He's not simply putting, you need a number 1 in this series. No, you need a different order of being altogether, an efficient cause sufficient to actualize all the intermediate causes and so forth. Okay, so crucial to note that the kind of infinite regress in the Kalam argument and the kind in the Thomistic arguments are actually different. Aquinas was operating off of the logic of Aristotle, blah, blah, blah. We already went into that. And here's one reason why this matters. Aristotle, being a good Greek, had to believe that the universe was always there. He's a materialist. And so in his way of thinking, there can't be an infinite regress in any direction, even if there was never a time when time and space were not, right? And so don't misunderstand. Thomas is not agreeing with Aristotle that the universe may really be infinite. He believes as a matter of faith, and he believes Scripture, that the universe had an ex nihilo beginning, that God created everything. But here's what's important about that. Even if the universe was eternal, you would still have to account for a first cause of motions and effects in everything right now, at every point on the space-time continuum. You'd still have to account for that. So why is that again? Well, again, Ed Phaser, most interesting Thomist in our day, answers this question in the following way. He says, quote, Aquinas is not saying that if you trace the series of movers back in time, you must eventually get to some temporally first mover. Rather, the immediate cause of an effect is simultaneous with that effect. So, Phaser says, he doesn't mean first in order of time, but rather first in the sense of being most fundamental in the order of what exists. Now, Craig recognizes this difference, by the way, and he says that, quote, the Thomist cosmological argument is based on the impossibility of an infinite regress of simultaneously operating causes. I think it covers that, but I think it's deeper than that. There's actually a very good reason behind even that. The force of the argument, again, I don't know if that picture is good at all, but I'm trying to make the point that they're making. The force of the argument is that there has to be something outside of the series of instrumental causes. Okay? There has to be something which is simply in act, who was not, or which, if you don't prefer at this point, which was not actualized by something else. Otherwise, the regress would still be happening, okay? And so all of this really depends on grasping some of these concepts of act and potency and so forth and so on. Another way to put Thomas's logic is this, and this is Phaser again. Quote, the things of our experience, again, down here, whatever it is, in the things of our experience, which are mixtures of actuality and potentiality, because they're all changing. They're all in motion, becoming other things. These could not exist even for a moment apart from a cause that is pure actuality. Only something whose existence is always already actual, and thus need not and could not be actualized by anything else, could terminate what would otherwise be a vicious explanatory regress. That's just his way of saying what I previously said. One last way to put the same thing. Just trying to say it in different ways. Phaser says about things that are contingent, and you've already heard that word, just not necessary, dependent. But another word we'll run into, if you haven't got it already, things that are composite. We'll talk about that in a future week. Simple versus composite just means made of parts. Of things that are made of parts and therefore change and derive and have their organizational principle from things outside of themselves. So in other words, things that we experience in this world. He says, even if the thing had no temporally prior cause, it would still require an ontologically prior cause. Now, why am I saying the same thing in 3 or 4 different ways? Again, just like with the ontological argument, I told you, I want to show you at the end of each of these arguments things we get for our theology from natural theology. Okay? Notice that this conclusion tells us quite a bit about this prime mover or first cause. Remember the objection. But why is that the God of the Bible? Or, but that leaves you light years away from the God of Scripture. Well, does it? The logic already demands that this is a being in pure act. No potential. Nothing in him dormant. Nothing in him could be acted upon from the outside. In other words, it already logically implies things like immutability, can't change. Impassibility, cannot suffer from the outside. So we already have some divine attributes starting to be stacked up by pure logic. People are nervous about that for some reason, but we'll really tackle that when we get to the attributes. Last point, I'm sorry I'm going to go late, but I am, and then we can stay after and whatever. But I've got to, if I don't do this, somebody's going to say, oh, you didn't even get to any objections. You wuss. I don't want that. I don't want to hear that. So let's go to some objections here. The earliest and most enduring objection among modern thinkers to the cosmological argument was leveled by David Hume. We've already met Hume. And many of his critics thought that Hume was denying cause and effect, denying causality. Not quite. What he was actually denying was that we can know the precise cause or matrix of causes behind any particular effect. In other words, he would use the word the power of cause or a necessary connection. We see things only on the surface, and we don't really discern the true power behind the causes. And so when we say that something caused something else, we really just do that by custom. We constantly associate the cue ball hitting into the 8 ball or the rooster crowing in the sunrise. And, you have all these examples that can mess up our thinking. But he denied that we could actually know any necessary connection between a particular cause and its particular effect. Now, why was he doing this? What was he up to? Well, this is meant to break the chains of any causal connection between the present universe and God. And the logic is simple. And I don't have time to write it up. I'm trying to get through time. So just follow along. Premise 1, Hume. Premise 1, we can discern the particular cause of a particular effect only if the necessary causal connection is discernible. And we don't observe that, right? I know it's a long way to say it, but that's his first premise. Number 2, no necessary causal connections are discernible. Therefore, no particular cause of a particular effect can be established of necessity. So he wasn't denying that things cause effects. He was saying we can't know the connection between any one cause. So you certainly can't start to trace it back to a particular kind of cause. That's Hume's argument. Quick rebuke to that, you lose a couple of things, which, by the way, Hume went this direction. He started as an empiricist. He became a skeptic because of this. He had a way to do science, but that's another story. 2 problems. First, if we have no intellectual capacities at all that are reliable to discern the nature of a particular cause to a particular effect, it's not just theology that falls, it's science that falls. You can't do science. And so if you're a modern scientist and an admirer of Hume, you may want to recheck which poison you want to take, because you can't have both. Secondly, and we're going to see this clearly next week with the epistemological argument, if naturalism is true, in other words, if nature is all there is, or it's all we can talk about intelligibly, if naturalism is true, then all human thoughts are nothing but cause and effect. And that means that all logical relationships are mere causes and effects. But bad things follow from that. If you can't know the precise relationship between cause and effect, then one of the causes you can't know is the logical ground you had to believe that there's no connection between cause and effect. And so the truth of every single statement would be undermined. We're going to do slow motion of that next week, courtesy of C.S. Lewis. But you wind up, it's a self-refuting argument. You lose not just science, you lose reason. Because reason, especially in a naturalistic conception, is merely cause and effect. You lose logic. You lose your reason for what caused, and it's not just, well, what caused that thought, Hume? It's what reason do you have to believe that? Which comes to mean the same thing if you're a naturalist. Again, we'll come back to that next week, but the very logic of the argument is self-refuting. Most serious objection to the Kalam cosmological argument, in my opinion, and really it's a challenge to both of them, is the idea that an infinite regress is impossible. I say this is a serious objection, not because it's good, but because it's an easy category mistake to make, and especially when really smart mathematicians like Bertrand Russell make that mistake. What he did in his History of Western Philosophy was he was arguing against Aquinas, and he basically objected to this and said, well, the series of negative integers ending with -1 is an instance to the contrary. In other words, it's an instance to the contrary that you can't have an infinite regress. But there's a fundamental difference between substances that are represented by numerical values as opposed to mathematical entities. And whatever status you want to give to mathematical entities, and if you're a materialist, you don't want to give them much. You just want to say it's something we invented, okay? And so a series of integers can never be instances of anything other than mathematical entities. We saw that with the hotel. They can't be that any more than a triangle could be an instance of the Trinity or even a slice of pizza. Those are not, at best, they're exemplified in a slice of pizza or something like that. So that's a category mistake. And Russell has been called on that by philosophers after that. Another British philosopher, J.L. Mackie, in his Miracle of Theism, argued that the same principle of infinite regress ought to be applied to God. Remember, I already told you that this doesn't work. This is a series. It's not infinity. Okay, and so, but he says, quote, if God exists for an infinite duration of time, see how he's trying to say, because he knows enough to know that it doesn't apply to God as infinity, but if God knows all things or is in all times, then, and if an infinite regress of events is impossible, then it follows that such an everlasting being could not exist. What mistake is he making? As if God being over time is... Now, William Lane Craig is going to have a harder time answering that objection, as we'll see that, because Craig's idea of God is that God is timeless before creation, but once creation happens, and it's a lot of theistic philosophers, that he's bound to time. So there's sequence there. So I don't know how they answer that, but that's their problem. We would say that God's eternality is that he transcends time. And so he is not bound to units of time and so forth. That's just not the God of Scripture. He's eternal, 1 Timothy 1:17. God's decrees are not just his being, but his decrees are before the ages began, 2 Timothy 1:19 and Titus 1:2. And so answering this objection is, Craig's problem perhaps, but it wouldn't be someone of a classical theological persuasion. We'll get more to that when we get to God's simplicity. Last objection, confluence of postmodern thinking and quantum physics. I already kind of brought it up, but let me give it to you. That can combine to make a monster combination of the first few objections. And in its simplest form, you'll hear this. I know you've heard this. This idea of causality and regress, that only applies to the realm of causality, namely the physical universe. You can't apply causality beyond the cosmos because the principles of causality do not apply outside of space-time. Now, aside from being a very bold claim for somebody that doesn't know anything about things outside of space and time, this objection is as misguided about the idea of causality as the Mill and Russell mistake was about, well, who caused God? So in logic, we call this the fallacy of begging the question. So what's the question that they're begging? Whether there is metaphysical cause or only physical cause is exactly what the theist and atheist are debating. And so you cannot settle that question by assuming it up front. That's called circular reasoning, where you assume in your premise what you're trying to conclude. Okay? Rather, one or the other, whether or not there's metaphysical cause and not just physical cause, that's going to have to be established as the conclusion to the argument, not assumed up front. Okay? So as we go on in our thinking, and we're going to see this logic of the cosmological argument show up in some of the other ones, we have to keep before our minds that causality is first metaphysical. It's first a formal principle and only secondarily physical. Another distinction Phaser made, but it's the same thing as the one we've already looked at. There is one more objection, and it's almost the same as Mackey's. They'll try to take what Phaser said about Aristotle and turn it on its head. And this is the last point, seriously. The skeptic could say, well, if there's a being of pure actuality, no potential in him, he's always in act, he has to undergo change in the act itself. He creates things, and presumably, at one time, that effect did not exist, and then the cause brought it about. So the cause, God, this being pure actuality, did something different than it previously did. And you'll see the same objection against immutability when we get to that attribute. At any rate, the change itself implies at least some potentiality in need of being actualized in that being. And so, the objection goes, the idea of a purely actual being is incoherent. Because in order to actualize other things, he had to do things that were not there that are there now. Okay? And quick response, this is both two fallacies. This is both a non sequitur, it doesn't follow, and it's a begging of the question. Let me explain that. Simply because in our experience down here of moving things, there is always change. So in other words, if something is changing something else, then it changes in order to do that. We already saw that in Aquinas' argument. Therefore, it must be the same about him. You're begging the question. You're begging the whole question. Whether or not a being can be pure actual and out of that cause things outside of himself that are changing. The change is happening in things outside of himself. We'll see that when we get to the attributes. To say that it must not be that way, it begs the whole question. So it's question begging. And it doesn't follow. It is a non sequitur. The critic needs to establish an essential connection between being an actualizer, which the squirrel that carries an acorn is an actualizer, and the being of pure act, God, is an actualizer. But the squirrel needed to be moved. God did not need to be moved to move. Okay? And so it doesn't just beg the question, it doesn't follow. Until somebody can make an essential connection between being an actualizer and being a mixture of actuality and potentiality, he hasn't established what he needs to do. And we're going to show that he cannot do that. The objections are boring. Some people think they're exciting because they believe in those objections. But as Mortimer Adler once said, people that object against the Thomistic and Aristotelian worldview, it turns out on instant replay that they haven't really read it, and they don't really understand what they're attacking. So, there's a lot more you can say about both of them, but I'll cut it there, and we'll open it to Q&A, and next time is the epistemological and the moral argument.